Well, good morning. Today we're going to start with definitions, beginning with literary criticism, literary theory, and literature. Normally, literary criticism is divided into three types or three categories: history of literary criticism, practical criticism, and theoretical criticism. What is required is that you have to have a copy of chapter one of the assigned book, which goes under the title Literary Criticism An Introduction to Theory and Practice, which I suppose that you've already got. So let us start. By the way, we are not going to go through the book line by line, but we may jump or leap according to the requirements of what is quite necessary for us to get along with the topic. What is left is your own duty to cover. Let us start with page 6. What is literary criticism? Matthew Arnold, the problem with literary criticism is that you may get across or exposed to so many names that you have no idea whatsoever about them. One of those names is Matthew Arnold. He is a 19th century poet and a critic. So what we are going to deal with is the definition that has already been set by Matthew Arnold in an essay which is entitled The Function of Literary Criticism at the Present Time. It was incorporated in a book by Matthew Arnold under the title Essays in Criticism. So the author, in trying to answer the question, what is literary criticism, has quoted Matthew Arnold. So let us read and follow up. Matthew Arnold, a 19th century literary critic, describes literary criticism as disinterested endeavor. By being disinterested means it's quite objective and with no biases. Endeavor to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world. He goes on to elaborate as to what is implicit or what is latent or what is in this definition. Implicit in this definition is that literary criticism is a disciplined activity. By being disciplined, he means that it should be very much objective and it's not open to everyone because there is a type of a criticism by um, by being called or labeled as anything goes criticism. Such kind of criticism does not have a room here. A disciplined activity that attempts describe, study, analyze, justify, interpret, and evaluate a work of art. All these activities are incorporated in the activity of literary criticism. In other words, literary criticism covers description, studying, analysis, justification, interpretation, and finally evaluation of work of art. By necessity, Arnold would argue this discipline attempts to formulate aesthetic and methodological principles. So, literary criticism has got two bases, one of which is aesthetic, and aesthetics is the science that studies beauty and methodological principles. That is to say, it should be guided by certain methodologies. On which the critic can evaluate a text. He goes on, anyone who attempts to evaluate text in this fashion is a literary critic, a term derived from two Greek words, krino, meaning a judge, and krites, meaning judge or jury person. So what we can see here is that he is working out the etymology of the word. Etymology علم دراسة وتاريخ تطور معاني الكلمات. Etymology. Judge or jury, a literary critic or a criticos is therefore a judge of literature. To put it in simple terms, criticism is comparatively equal to, or a critic is comparatively equal to, a judge of literature. He goes on to raise a question and thereby answers it by trying to name who was the first person who can deserve such a term or such a label. The first recorded such judge is the 4th century BCE teacher Philetas, who arrived in Alexandria in 305 BCE to tutor, that to tutor means to teach a child who would become King Ptolemy II. I suppose that you have already come across a person by the name of Ptolemy, because there is Ptolemaic theory of astronomy when you studied your own, or when you studied the 16th century poetry. When judging literature, Philetas was actively engaged in the disciplined activities of literary criticism. We go on. When we consider its function and its relationship to text, literary criticism is not usually considered a discipline in and of itself, for it must be related to something else. That is to say, criticism can never be independent unless there is a work of art to work on. And this gets clearer. Without the work of art, the activity of criticism cannot exist. In other words, priority is given to literature first, and literary criticism as a disciplined activity comes next. Significantly, we could not analyze a text without having, at the very beginning, certain questions at the back of our mind. And these questions are going to be tabulated as follows. Look at this. When analyzing a text, literary critics ask basic questions, such as these about the philosophical, psychological, functional, descriptive nature of the text itself. Unfortunately, we don't have any philosophical background, because there is no course in our study called Introduction to Philosophy, and philosophy is comparatively missing. Psychological, although in studying novels, plays, and poems, you are dealing with so many aesthetic aspects, whether it is in the form of a character, man or a woman, but we don't have, again, a study, or we don't have a background in psychology. That's why you can recognize that to be a critic is not an easy task. It is multi-layered task. It draws on so many disciplines, beginning with philosophy, psychology, functionality, linguistics, and so on and so forth. Let us look at those questions. And the answer to each one of these takes a lot of time. And if it is to be covered, it might take more than 6 months to cover each single question. But we are going to go through them as it is required in the text. Does a text have only one correct meaning? Is a text always didactic? By to be didactic means to carry a moral lesson. That is to say, does literature give moral lessons, or is there any moral aspect in a text you read? That is, he is going to explain it. Must a reader learn something from every text? Can a text be read only for enjoyment? Does a text affect each reader in the same way? And this is very much closely related to what is critically called response of readers. What is your own response when you finished reading a novel? What is your own personal response when you finish reading a play? And it goes on. Along with these questions, there are some other questions. This is on page 7. How is a text influenced by the culture of the author and the culture in which it is written? That is to say, how far influential culture is supposed to be or is supposed to exercise on the author. How could we understand a text in the framework of a different culture? And you can recognize this by having a very example. If you read Othello here in Iraq, your response to it will be different if the play is read in South Africa, for example, and hence the significance of culture. Again, what part or function does gender play in the writing or reading of the text? In other words, a woman reading a text will be radically different from a man reading the same text. And this has got something to do with what is called feminist criticism. And gender is not only used in grammar, as I suppose, but you have come across it, but also gender. This is a cultural concept. What makes a woman into a woman? How far influential culture is on response of women? Does a woman read in the same way that a man reads? And so on and so forth. How does our personal feelings affect our interpretation of a text? That is to say, your response as a student will be different from someone else's response um, in terms of your own personal background. If you are well read in a drama or in the novel, definitely you are going to respond to a text in a different way from someone who has never read a book across his own life. And finally, can a text become a catalyst to change in a given culture? A catalyst is virtually a chemical term, which means in Arabic, just to help you, العامل الفلزي هو الذي يساعد في التفاعلات ويخرج من التفاعل دون أن يلحق به أي أثر يذكر. So, can a text be a catalyst for change? This is the social aspect or the social functions of literature. And you know, this chemical term, which figures here, is first used by T.S. Eliot in an essay, a very famous essay, under the title Tradition and the Individual Talent, التراث والموهبة الفردية. So now we have covered two basic points. One, what is literary criticism? Second, what are the basic questions that critics often ask when dealing with a literary text? And you can recognize they are of a wide range. Almost to the middle of page 7, we are going to have a division or classification rather of literary criticism. Let's read. Traditionally, literary critics involve themselves in either theoretical or practical criticism. That's to say, as I started, criticism can be divided in two types, one theoretical and the other practical. Practical criticism is a type of criticism that dates back in its actual origin to a critic by the name of I.A. Richards, who published a book under the title Practical Criticism in 1929. And he has got another book which is purely theoretical, Principles of Literary Criticism, which was published in 1924. If there is a time, I might speak to you about I.A. Richards, who he is, and what books he has written, and how far he is influential as far as another school of criticism, which goes under the name or the label of American New Criticism. So at least let us limit ourselves to two types of criticism as they are tabulated. Yeah, practical criticism and theoretical criticism. So, what is a theoretical criticism? He is going to answer. Theoretical criticism formulates the theories, principles, and tenets of the nature and value of art. By citing general aesthetic and moral principles of art, theoretical criticism provides the necessary framework for practical criticism. In other words, practical criticism usually works against the background of a theory. Without a theory, there will be no practical criticism. Hence, theory and practice are closely related together. Theory comes first and practice comes second. Practical criticism, also known as applied criticism. Applied criticism. This is a different name uh, to what is called practical criticism. What job does it do? It applies the theories and tenets of theoretical criticism. Tenets means principles or premises, and what you are required to do is that this is a piece of advice for you. Whenever you read, try to keep a dictionary beside you, and when you come across a word that you have no you haven't an idea of what it means, try to look it up. To look it up in your own dictionary. Never try to rely on your own memory, because memories have gaps. للذاكرة في الذاكرة فجوات. So, yes, using the theories and principles of theoretical criticism, the practical critic defines the standards of taste. Taste is a very significant, has a significant place here. We've got literary taste. Okay, so is the case true when we eat food. It, this meal has got a very good taste. With the help of taste, you can tell the difference between what's good and what's bad, and explains, evaluates, or justify a particular piece of literature. A further distinction is made between the practical critic, who posits that there is only one theory or set of principles a critic may use when evaluating a literary work, and the absolutist critic. So here we have got two types of critic: practical critic and absolutist critic. Absolutist is derived from the word absolute, المطلق. Hmm? And the relativistic critic. This is a different type of a critic, one who uses various and even contradictory theories in critiquing a text. That's to say, in studying, analyzing, and evaluating a work, a literary work, the critic may draw upon. وdraw upon means to borrow from. يعني في العربية يمتاح من، والامتياح هو أخذ الماء من البئر. One who uses various and even contradictory theories in critiquing a text. The basis for either kind of work of a critic or any form of criticism is literary theory. So criticism, whether it is applied or theoretical, is literary theory. Without theory, practical criticism cannot exist. This final statement paves the way for what is to come. That is to say, to answer the question, which is comparatively as important as the first one: what is literary theory? What is literary theory? This is an area of study which is comparatively more difficult and not handy to everyone, because, after all, it is a literary theory. You might have come across the word theory when you were introduced to linguistics. We've got linguistic theories and so on and so forth. As he has done with the etymology of the word criticism, he is going to tell us something more about the origin, evolution, and development of the term theory. But let us move to page 8. Page 8, what we tend to forget during the reading of O'Connor, the example he is citing is a short story by a famous short story writer, O'Connor. It's not necessary that you have an idea about the story. What is required is to have some sort of a general idea as what is included here. What we tend to forget during the reading of any short story or any other text is that we have already read other literary works. What he means here is that when you start reading a literary work or a piece of a drama or whatever, this doesn't mean that you are going to start from scratch, يعني من الصفر. But you have already read some earlier works which stand as a background for you, against which you are going to measure, evaluate, and describe what you are reading. And this is what is usually called intertextuality. By the way, intertextuality is a critical term which means in English the meaning of a text cannot be determined solely or alone by the text itself, because there are quite often certain allusions يعني الإحالات to some other literary works, some other literary works. And this term is coined by a Bulgarian critic by the name of Julia Kristeva. I don't have the time, nor the interest, to elaborate upon the term and textuality. It's quite necessary to follow up the evolution of the term, how it has migrated. ليس فقط البشر هم من يهاجرون، وإنما هنا يعني النظريات أيضا تهاجر. And this has been studied very carefully by Edward Said in his essay Traveling Theory, النظرية المرتحلة. This is a very brief general information that I'm giving you while we are going through these handy pages. Intertextuality is a term that is also used in Arabic culture. It has been translated into what is called التناص. Intertextuality يعني بالعربية التناص. تناصص هذا النص مع نص آخر. He is going to elaborate. Follow him. Our response to any text or the principles of practical criticism we apply to it is largely a conditioned or socially constructed one. That is how we arrived at meaning in fiction is in part determined by our experiences. To understand a novel, sometimes is highly essential to relate to some characters in it. Your relation to this character is determined by your individual experience, and experiences differ from one person to another. That is to say, I'm going to give you an example. As an Iraqi reader reading Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, you are going to relate to Mrs. Ramsey in a way different from an African. And the exclusive factor that shapes and determines your response is your experience. How well read are you? If you are going to, I mean, if nobody could start from scratch, or nobody could start out of the blue, as they say. To sum it up, or to put it in a nutshell, as they say, إجمالا, let us read the lines. When we can clearly articulate our personal philosophical framework when reading a text and explain how this mindset directly influences our values and aesthetic judgments about the text, the assumption, we are well on our way to developing a coherent, unified literary theory. That's to say, by reading against the background of our personal experiences, infused with certain مطعمة infused with certain philosophical framework, إطار الفلسفي. So how could, and this is the problem. How are you going to respond to a literary text without having uh, a philosophical background? And unfortunately, as I said, philosophy here is virtually missing. So to be clear, let us read the lines, which are supposed to be a definition or an explication, يعني شرح, an explication of what is meant by literary theory. The assumptions, conscious or what otherwise, that undergird means underline, underscore, our understanding and interpretation of language. You can recognize that these lines are actually very explosive. هذه الأسطر انفجارية. It requires a lot of work and it takes a lot of time to explain them. And as I said some time earlier, that this language of literary criticism is right away different from the types of language that you are exposed to, whether in linguistics, in the novel, or in the drama. This is what is called in linguistics meta language, اللغة الشارحة, meta language. The ways we construct meaning and our understanding of art, culture, and aesthetics and ideology. Again, since we have no background in philosophy, so is the case true. We have no background in aesthetics. And the aesthetics is the science that studies beauty, what makes the beautiful beautiful. This is one of the basic questions that aesthetics is supposed to answer. And again, we have no background. And this is the problem. And ideology. This is a very important term which has developed across the years. Where the literary criticism involves our analysis of a text, literary theory concerns itself with our understanding of the ideas, concepts, intellectual assumptions upon which rest our actual literary critique. Going back to literary criticism and its etymology, and we said that it is equal or adequate to what is called criticos. And in the final analysis, a critic is supposed to be a judge of literature. Likewise, he's going to give us some ideas from where does or is the word theory derived. من أين أتت كلمة نظرية? To the bottom of the page, never say in the bottom of the page. This is Arabic. A better understanding of literary theory can be gained by investigating the etymology. I've already explained to you what's meant by etymology. That is to say, the science that studies the evolution and development of words. The etymology of the word theory itself derived from the Greek word theoria. The word theory means a view or perspective of the Greek stage. يعني النظرية هي وجهة نظر أو منظور في المسرح اليوناني. وطبعا وجهة نظرك أو طريقة نظرك تعتمد على المكان أو الموقع المكاني اللي تحتله. وبالتالي المرأة تختلف عن الرجل في وجهة نظره. This is for your own general knowledge. We go back derived from the Greek word theoria. The word theory means a view or perspective of the Greek stage. Literary theory then offers to us a view of life, an understanding of why we interpret text the way we do. Interpret, we've got exegesis, explication, and interpretation. Exegesis يعني التأويل الإنجيلي. Explication يعني الشرح بالتفسير, and interpretation التأويل. And there is a science by the title or by the label of hermeneutics, التأويل. And again, we don't have a course in interpretation. And you can recognize how problematic things are. Literary theory offers to us a view of life, an understanding of why we interpret text the way we do. Consider the various places in the theater that we, the audience, may sit, so that our perspective and our understanding or interpretation of things largely depends on the place we occupy. If you are at the front, your perspective your perspective will be radically different from someone who sits at the back. If you are in the auditorium يعني قاعة المسرح, depending on our seats, whether close to the stage, far back, to the far left, to the far right, or in the middle row, our view and therefore our interpretation of the events taking place on the stage will alter, will change. Literary theory figuratively and literally asks where we are sitting when we are reading a text. This is a metaphorical understanding of what is meant by theory. Theory is determined by the place we occupy, as he said, at the front, at the back, in the middle, and so on and so forth. What exactly is influencing us during the reading process? Is it our culture? That is to say, how far influential our culture is supposed to be in shaping our response to literary works. Okay. Is it our understanding of the nature of literature itself? Is it our political, religious, or social views? Is it our family background? These and similar questions and their answers will directly and indirectly and consciously and unconsciously uh, be affecting our interpretation and our enjoyment of lack or lack thereof of a text. To give you an example, if someone goes through a love experience and he fails, certainly his reading of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet will be very much different from someone who has got a successful relationship. Moreover, a well articulated theory, literary theory, also assumes that an innocent reading of a text or sheer emotional or spontaneous reaction to a work does not exist. In other words, there is no innocent reading. لا توجد هناك قراءة بريئة. Because when we read, we are influenced by so many factors, ranging from our culture to our personal experiences. And so is the case true of language itself. Language is not innocent. اللغة ليست بريئة. It may persuade you, it may put you off, and so on and so forth. Definitely, or honestly speaking, if you want me to elaborate on innocence of reading and innocence of language, it takes us more than 6 years. Sorry, 6 months, because these are very significant terms. Right. I have no idea as to how far familiar you are with the ramifications, تفرعات, ramifications of language functions and so on and so forth. So, to conclude, as far as literary theory is concerned, we have arrived at a major conclusion that is no innocent reading there is. And as I said, language itself is not innocent either. Well, our understanding of reality and its nature differs again from someone to someone else, and this theoretical framework is summed up in a term called worldview, which is available right after making meaning from text. Worldview is originally a German term. It is equal to what is called Weltschauung in German, الرؤية إلى العالم. And your worldview as an Iraqi living in this part of the world will be very much different from someone else's living in some other part of the world. And the world, the term worldview is originally used in German sociology. German sociology, and it develops and it's set in the circulation, and it is again transferred from sociology into literary criticism. To speak about worldview in detail takes a lot of time, and there is no room for me here to speak about it. And this is the problem again, I repeat, with literary criticism. You are exposed to so many names and so many terms. And that's why to understand a criticism requires a very solid background, a background that touches on so many fields, beginning with linguistics, literature, with, in its different genres, and economics, and so on and so forth. One of the most illustrative example is the term worldview. And let us move on. Upon such a conceptual framework, literary theory, that is to say, literary theory is based on each individual's worldview. Whether that framework is well reasoned or simply a matter of habit or past teaching, readers respond to works of art via means across or through their worldview. That's to say, worldview determines a lot and it plays a leading role in shaping a reader's response to a literary work. And we are going to have some ideas about what is involved in the worldview, given that given that worldview, as I said, is a sociological term. Okay, right. From this philosophical core of beliefs bring their evaluation of the goodness, worthiness, and value of art itself, using their worldviews either consciously or unconsciously as a yardstick, as a standard, with the help of which we can measure things. Yardsticks يعني معيار by which to measure and value their experiences. Readers respond to individual works of literature, ordering and valuing each separate or collective experience in each text based on the system of beliefs housed in their worldviews. By the way, there is a school of criticism originated, evolved, and developed in Germany by the title of Reader Response Theory, headed by a figure called Wolfgang Iser, which touches on how readers respond to literary text. But this is in Germany. The earlier attempts in this regard is also available in the States. What I mean by states, that is to say, United States of America. And there is a lady by the name of Louise M. Rosenblatt. Her book is called The Reader, the Text, and the Poem, 1978. This is the edition that the author is using. And you have to have an idea how to write a bibliographical item of a book because you are required to submit a piece of research this year. This is the edition of 1978. The book was originally published in 1934. And her theory is called the transactional theory. That is to say, how how the reader responds to a literary text under the title. I don't know. I'm not. You are not required to read the whole book by Rosenblatt. Again, the book is not available here. So now, at least, you've got some ideas to articulate as regards theory. But there is another point which is closely related to theory, were what is called meta theory, يعني النظرية الجامعة. And I suppose that you have already been familiarized with what is meant by meta, this prefix in linguistics. Meta means across or beyond. Let us read the lines at the bottom of the page. Because no literary theory can account for all the various factors included in everyone's conceptual framework, and because we as readers all have different literary experiences, this is the important, there can exist no meta theory, no single overarching literary theory. Overarching means dominating literary theory and encompasses all possible interpretations of a text suggested by readers. As long as there is no innocent language and there is no innocent reading, equally significant, there is no meta theory, a theory which can explain, interpret all the factors involved in our response to a literary text. لا توجد هناك نظرية جامعة يمكن أن تقدم لنا تأويلا لجميع النصوص. And this is quite important to know. No meta theory. Possible interpretations of a text suggested by its readers. There can be no single correct literary theory for in and of itself. Each literary work asks valid questions of and about the text. So there are so many linguistic theories in studying or approaching language, so is the case true. There are no single theory that can interpret for us all literary works. And as such, there are so many theories. And no one theory is capable of exhausting all legitimate questions. I'd like to draw your attention as- to the terms valid and legitimate. ما معناه أننا في الوقت الحاضر لا نتحدث وفق صيغ الصحيح والخطأ لأن القيم نسبية. علينا أن نتحدث على وفق المشروع وغير المشروع، يعني إيمانا بنسبية القيم، relativity in values. In other words, what may be acceptable to you may not be acceptable to someone else, but you have no right to impose your values on others, and hence the significance of literary theory. Let us move on. On page 12, at the top, at almost at the top, we read, because the various schools of a criticism. In a criticism, there are so many schools, beginning with Plato and Aristotle and ending with the modern age. And to speak of those schools, even if we do it briefly, it takes more than a year to cover. Because the various schools of criticism and the theories on which they are based ask different questions about the same work in literature, these theoretical schools provide an abundance of options. So, the significance of literary theories is that you are offered as many options as possible. And by the way, our life, or the life we live and go through, is an endless series of options. إن الحياة سلسلة غير متناهية من الخيارات, beginning with your own morning meal and up to the very moment before you sleep. And this is the good aspect of life. We have got as many choices, but sometimes we are forced to have a zero option. الخيار بالدرجة صفر. That's to say we have no choices at all. an abundance of options from which readers can choose to broaden their understanding not only of text but also of their society, their culture, and their own humanity. The more options we have, the more able we are to choose from the list. By embracing literary theory, to embrace means to adopt. Embracing literary theory, we learn about literature. And more important, we are also tolerant. We are also taught tolerance. Tolerance lexically means التحمل, but in this context means التسامح. We have to have tolerance in dealing with others. We respect the point of views rendered by others. احترام الآخر وآراءه. And this is the significant one of the important lessons we learn by studying literary theory. We nurture the spirit of tolerance. We are also taught tolerance for other people's beliefs. By rejecting or ignoring theory, we are in danger of canonizing ourselves as literary saints. To canonize طبعا هذه المفردة ذات بعد ديني. لما يقرر البابا أو الحبر الأعظم في الفاتيكان أن يجعل من امرأة أو رجل قديسا, they say he is canonized. Canonized. فيجب علينا أن لا نكون قديسين ونفرض ما نراه صحيحا على الآخرين. We, he said, canonizing ourselves as literary saints who possess divine knowledge and who can therefore supply the one and only correct interpretation for a given text. And canonization is derived from the word canon, يعني الأعمال الأدبية الأثيرة التي تجاوزت امتحان التاريخ وبقيت بسمعتها وأهميتها من العصر القديم إلى العصر الحاضر. يسموها أمهات الكتب أو عيون الكتب. والترجمة الحديثة لكلمة كان هو المعتمد. And I would like to refer you to a very famous poem by John Donne, which I suppose that you have already studied in your second year by the name, by the title of Canonization. I don't know whether you have studied it or not. Just these are some remarks that I would like to make as far as canonization is concerned. As literary saints who possess divine knowledge and who can therefore supply the one and only correct interpretation for a given text, when we oppose or disregard or ignore literary theory, we are in the genre and the danger of blindly accepting our more frequently than not unquestioned prejudices and assumptions. Quite often, we are influenced by our prejudices يعني تحيزاتنا. So we have to be objective and neutral in dealing with literary text. We have to recognize and to evaluate what there is. By embracing literary theory and literary criticism, its practical application, we can willingly participate in that seemingly endless historical conversation about the nature of a humanity and of the humanities concerned as expressed in literature. We have to conduct conversation not only with ourselves, with other people, but with other texts. With the text, we have to. And in the process, we can begin to question our concepts of ourselves. There is a very important activity which is largely missing to raise the right questions at the right time. Our society and our culture and how texts themselves help define and continually redefine these concepts. Let us stop at this particular point and we will have a meeting which is going to be mainly concerned with another question, that is, what is literature? If you go back in your memory to the early days, that is to say your primary school days, up to modern, up to the this time, you are already being exposed to different types of literary works But have you ever asked yourself a question? What is literature? Literature is so familiar to the point that its familiarity has blinded our eyes or blinded us in the sense that we haven't asked a question as what is literature. That's enough